In the formidable world of the Vikings, where valor and fearlessness were the highest virtues, there existed individuals whose intensity and eccentricity astonished even the most seasoned warriors. We speak of those who embodied the most captivating manifestations of Norse madness, the Skalds, the Jomsvikings, and, finally, the Berserkers. Let us delve into this world, beginning with those who were masters of language, the Skalds. A skald was not merely a poet or a singer but a highly respected court artist, serving at the court of a Scandinavian king, konungur, or a powerful chieftain. Their work was not just entertainment. It was a living, dynamic chronicle, capturing the exploits and achievements of the Viking Brotherhood as they unfolded. Even centuries later, their poetic works remain invaluable historical sources, allowing modern researchers to glimpse into a long-past era. The feasts of meat, generous tankards of ale, and jingling coins they received as rewards were, without a doubt, well-deserved. It was thanks to their art that the names of countless participants in legendary battles and accounts of other significant events from the Viking Age have reached us. Their influence was not limited to powerful konungur. Even the fates of seemingly ordinary people, destined for oblivion, found their place in history through these masters of language. Skalds were the creators of sagas, detailed, sprawling narratives that described the most important events of their time. Their subject matter was not limited to bloody raids and heroic battles. For example, a flawlessly conducted legal process at the Thing, the public assembly, could very well become the central theme of such a saga. Beyond sagas, other genres of skaldic poetry existed. Visor, for instance, were concise verses created for special occasions. Draper were solemn praise poems, extolling virtues and deeds, while conversely, served to demean and defame. Surprisingly, some Draper could function as a head ransom. In other words, a skald who had committed a serious crime could avoid severe punishment if they managed to compose a sufficiently skillful and flattering praise poem. Skaldic poetry possessed a truly unique and unmistakable style. On one hand, sagas demonstrated an astonishing ability to express much with minimal words. They often read like dry reports, at times resembling court transcripts, yet they were filled with vivid imagery and permeated with dark humor. For example, one might encounter lines such as, "He was so composed that he could be held by a single man," which underscored incredible self-possession. Or an even more striking example, "He was counting silver at the time, so when his severed head flew off, it said, 10, which is an instance of truly dark yet witty humor. At the other end of skaldic art were kennings, incredibly intricate metaphors that enriched the verses. Thus, Storm of Swords meant battle, Red Weep referred to blood, and Iron Ravens symbolized death-bearing arrows. The complexity of kennings could reach astonishing levels, creating layered images. Take, for instance, the phrase "serpent's lair of Thor's shirt." Here, Thor's shirt is the chainmail protecting the warrior. The serpent of Thor's shirt is the sword hidden beneath it, and its lair is, essentially, the sheath. This entire complex construction describes something as commonplace as a sword sheath. Or, for example, the plundering of a homestead, a common occurrence for Vikings, could be poetically depicted in a saga as feeding the goose of wounds, which lent a peculiar, grim beauty to the brutal act. One of the most vivid and perhaps curious episodes preserved in the sagas recounts a rather important matter, a grand dispute between two groups of Icelanders that erupted over a beached whale carcass. The situation was so absurd that one of the victims even died from a blow with a whale rib. The climax of this saga unfolds not on the battlefield, as one might expect, but within the walls of a court, where the case was won through clever legal tactics. Modern lawyers would likely have a good laugh reading about the debates of these bearded men concerning jurisdiction and legality. However, as was often the case in those times, the matter ultimately concluded with the good guys transforming the legal proceedings into their usual format, a fierce, wall-to-wall brawl. According to the saga, on the villain's side, not everyone fought as bravely as they had promised, which adds irony to the narrative. Regarding the origin of skaldic poetry, the Vikings, of course, had their own astonishing legend. After a devastating war, the gods decided to cement their peace by spitting together into a bowl. From this divine spittle, they created Kvasir, the wisest of all beings, capable of answering any question in the universe. However, Kvasir was cunningly murdered by two dwarfs, who brewed a magical mead from his blood that bestowed unprecedented poetic talent. Then, a mighty giant took this mead from the dwarfs and entrusted his daughter to guard the precious drink vigilantly. But the god Odin, the great trickster and patron of poetry, seduced the guardian, stole the mead, and fled, spilling some of the precious liquid onto the ground along the way. This is why a skald was considered someone who received their gift through a special grace of the gods, a kind of divine inspiration. Interestingly, this divine patronage did not prevent skalds from engaging in the most unusual, and sometimes dangerous, activities in their free time. The greatest skald in history is considered to be the legendary Egil Skallagrimsson. Although scholars today have some doubts about the historical existence of this figure, according to tradition, Egil himself strongly disliked it when he or his talent were questioned. Those who did not appreciate his poetry risked losing an eye, a leg, or an arm, or even having their throat bitten through, and Egil would always compose a scathing visor about it afterward, immortalizing his vengeance in verse. In more mundane cases, skalds unhesitatingly plunged directly into the thick of battles to witness events firsthand, and then describe them with maximum accuracy in their works. Commanders often brought several spare skalds, understanding that not all of them would survive the battles, becoming unwitting sacrifices for the sake of art. However, skalds were just one of the unique Scandinavian phenomena. In the Viking world, there also existed a mysterious warrior order known as the Jomsvikings. It is worth noting that evidence of their actual existence is so scarce that some modern scholars still doubt their authenticity, considering them more of a legend. Officially, the Jomsvikings were a group of elite mercenaries. In that era, Scandinavia, abundant with mighty warriors, produced many fighters who survived by selling their battle axes and swords to various conungur and rulers. Their lifestyle largely resembled the coastal brotherhood of Caribbean pirates, living by their own harsh laws. According to legends, this warrior order was founded by the Danish king Harald Bluetooth. The Jomsvikings built their own impregnable fortress on the Baltic coast at the mouth of the Oder River, which served as their main base. They lived by mercenary work and daring raids, but they bound themselves by an incredibly strict and peculiar code of conduct. This code demanded a complete severance of all ties with their past life, strictly forbade having a wife or permanent partner, required absolute loyalty to the brotherhood, enforced the strictest discipline, and obliged them to place all spoils into a common fund. The logic of this approach was perfectly clear: to detach new members from any external connections or obligations outside the fortress, ensuring their complete and undivided loyalty to the order. But this is just the beginning of our immersion into the world of Scandinavian madness. Even more captivating discoveries await us. It is noteworthy that among the Jomsvikings were not only Scandinavians, but also representatives of Slavic peoples. Their famous fortress, Jomsborg, was located in Slavic lands, and many local Slavs readily joined them as mercenaries. Despite their renown, the number of Jomsvikings was relatively small, only a few hundred warriors. However, in those times, armies were rarely numerous, and a force of 500 to 600 skilled and highly disciplined fighters could significantly enhance any military power, representing a formidable force on the battlefields. Despite having a strict code of honor, the Jomsvikings were, in essence, mercenaries in the most unsavory sense of the word. When circumstances were not in their favor, they would not hesitate to flee or betray their employers, especially if payment had been made in advance. It was not uncommon for them to take payment from one side and then fight for their opponents. In ancient sagas, the Jomsvikings are consistently portrayed as models of treachery. The culmination of their dubious deeds was the betrayal of the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, who had hired them to fight against the Danes, Swedes, and his own rebellious Norwegian subjects. Olaf met his death in a naval battle, and this act of betrayal became the most infamous and widely known achievement of the Jomsvikings. Ironically, this fact may serve as indirect confirmation of their real existence, as it is unlikely that anyone would invent stories about failures and traitors. Had they been fictional characters, they would likely have been depicted as legendary and invincible heroes. The Jomsvikings certainly made a lot of noise in their time, but their fame proved short-lived. In the 11th century, Magnus the Good, king of Norway and Denmark, stormed their citadel, completely plundered and destroyed it, leveled its fortifications, and disbanded this mercenary unit. Nevertheless, being highly skilled fighters, they did not remain idle for long. It is said that Jomsviking veterans formed the core of the personal guard of the powerful king Knut the Great during the period when he united Denmark, England, and Norway under his rule, which attests to the enduring demand for their military prowess. Another classic Viking archetype that stirs the imagination is the Berserker. Modern pop culture eagerly cultivates the image of a fierce warrior clad in animal hide over bare skin, supposedly drinking potions made from poisonous mushrooms, and entering a furious trance on the battlefield, sweeping everything in their path. Many Viking Age sources describe enraged berserkers biting their shields in fits of battle frenzy. Even a famous chess set from that era contains several pawns depicted biting their shields with wild, insane looks. In historical chronicles, berserkers usually appear in one of two roles, either as exceptionally brave and fearless warriors, or as complete outcasts whom no one in their right mind would want to approach. Initially, berserkers were individuals dedicated to the god Odin. In combat, they would enter a special state of frenzy known as Berserksgang, charging at the enemy in a furious, unstoppable rage, completely ignoring their own wounds. The word berserker itself means warrior in a bear shirt, implying their desire to embody and become as wild as a mighty beast. Legends attributed invulnerability to them in battles, but in reality, berserkers were merely reckless to an extreme degree, which made them extremely formidable opponents. A typical Viking had no desire to trade his life for an enemy's, but berserkers considered such an outcome an excellent plan. This made fighting them incredibly difficult, as they relentlessly charged forward, disregarding any obstacles in their path. However, they also perished quickly. Rage allowed them to ignore the pain of injuries, but did not provide actual physical protection. A berserker could break into the heart of battle and strike down many enemies, but if someone pierced them with a spear, they died just like any other mortal warrior. Despite their vulnerability, berserkers were highly valued during warfare. However, in peacetime, they were considered dangerously insane and openly despised. Between battles, berserkers led an antisocial lifestyle, engaging in looting, sowing chaos, and even killing people for their own amusement. It is important to remember that even in the Viking Age, most Scandinavians were farmers. These people, if they participated in raids as Vikings, usually did so in their youth to acquire wealth. While we often hear of Vikings dreaming of dying in battle, in reality, most of them sought to accumulate silver, establish a farm with slaves and livestock, marry, and live in prosperity until the end of their days. Berserkers simply did not fit this picture and were not well liked in society. In historical sources, being compared to a berserker was far from a compliment. It was more of an insult. Fathers absolutely did not want their daughters to have any dealings with a berserker. In sagas, berserkers were typically depicted as bandits and ruthless killers. Berserkers often fully exploited their right to duel. They provoked legitimate duels to the death, known as holmgang, where the victor took the loser's property. In essence, this was legalized robbery, cloaked in ancient traditions. The fate of a berserker was usually grim. Although they were sometimes recruited as permanent members of retinues, including as bodyguards, more often than not, they ended up outlawed. Once this happened, a swift and violent end usually awaited them. No matter how fierce a berserker was, how wildly their eyes rolled, or how hard they bit their shield, a dozen determined farmers armed with spears still held the advantage over one of them. The berserker's madness was a very real mental state, and people, in essence, had mastered the art of inducing themselves into such a state. In Iceland, this madness was eventually declared a crime in itself, and those guilty of it were strictly punished, which indicates society's desire to curb this uncontrolled rage. In the modern world, a widespread hypothesis has taken root that ancient Scandinavian warriors, known as berserkers, consumed a brew made from fly agaric mushrooms before combat. However, If one carefully considers the clinical manifestations of intoxication from these mushrooms, it becomes evident that they could hardly contribute to effectiveness in battle. Symptoms such as vivid hallucinations, significant impairment of motor coordination, uncontrollable seizures, and bouts of vomiting would inevitably become serious obstacles for a person engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The great Icelandic skald and historian Snorri Sturluson did once mention a certain troll drink, but the precise meaning of this expression remains a subject of speculation. The mushroom theory itself first appeared in the 18th century through the works of a Swedish scholar who, it should be noted, conducted no experiments on himself. Thus, it can be stated with full certainty that the notion of mushrooms as the source of Berserkers' battle fury is a significantly later invention. Historical sources lack systematic or convincing mentions of the use of hallucinogenic substances. The process of Christianization in Scandinavia definitively pushed Berserkers to the periphery of society. These bearmen, or wolfmen, could not be integrated into the new religious system, nor could their traditional dedication to the mighty gods of the Norse pantheon, Thor or Odin. At this turning point, the term Berserker itself gradually transformed, becoming synonymous with robber or bandit. Their role in heroic sagas was to fall at the hands of a virtuous and noble hero, symbolizing the triumph of the new order. In real life, however, peaceful Scandinavian farmers, exhausted by endless violence and plunder, often simply dealt with berserkers by beating them to death with clubs, thereby putting an end to their